Hi, and welcome to this special meeting of the Board of Supervisors, October 28th, 2020 at 6:30 p.m. Today, we are covering the 2021 budget. If you would like to call in for public comment, please dial 646-558-8656 and enter meeting ID 867-4793-6033. Followed by the hash or pound sign. And we're ready to get started, Fred.
Thank you, Monica. Welcome to this special meeting of the Board of Supervisors. I call this to order and ask that you join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'll now call the roll. Supervisor Blundy?
Here.
Supervisor Lewis? I see you, John, but I don't hear you. But I'll assume you're here.
Present.
Supervisor McCartney?
I am here, yes.
And Supervisor Grenier? I think he is traveling from work and he may be on later. We have a quorum. And at this point, we'll go right to the manager's presentation of the 2021 budget.
Thank you. Now, I think the first thing that's important to mention, and we did this in a previous meeting, is that what's presented tonight is not being voted on, is an intermediate step before the board would consider a preliminary budget. As a reminder to the board and information to the public, when the board passes a preliminary budget, there are certain restrictions then to the level that changes can be made. So this step of a presentation of a budget allows the board additional time to ask questions, to give thoughts to what their priorities would be before that preliminary budget would be considered. As we talked about in the last meeting, and this is certainly for the pleasure of the board, our next scheduled meeting is next Wednesday, which is the 4th. I would anticipate, unless the board has a different schedule it would want to pursue, that the preliminary budget would be contemplated on November 18th. We then would have a legal obligation to post that budget for 20 days before we could make any official changes to it under certain restrictions. With then, if the budget was preliminarily passed on November 18th, then it would be contemplated for final approval on December 16th. Now, that's just keeping in mind the existing scheduled meetings that we have. The board always has the ability and the right to schedule additional meetings if it deems that necessary, to give additional time and for additional consideration. So first, tonight we will have available here staff members. Chief Caluzzi is here. Greg Hucklebridge, the Public Works Director, Monica Tierney, the Park and Rec Director, Jim Majewski, the Planning and Zoning Director, as well as Andy Pokel, our municipal engineer, and Mike Atera from Spirit Golf, who oversees the operation of our golf course. I'm going to try to go through everything fairly efficiently. I wasn't anticipating, I'll do whatever is the pleasure of the board, to go line by line through the budget. Typically, we would do that, more likely to do that when we're doing the budget preliminarily, but I'm happy to do that if the board would want. That's why I have staff members here. But I'd rather do a pass through on our finances, on the primary larger financial items in the budget beyond just staff and office products and the little things that we look at on a line by line basis. So if that's okay with you, Dr. Weiss, that I can go in that direction. I have a PowerPoint that I'd like to pull up if we could to get started.
Unless there's objection by the majority of the board, I think we can continue.
Good.
Go ahead, Kirk.
Monica, can we pull that up, please?
Yeah, I'm pulling it up now.
It sounds like aliens are landing, but I think we're fine.
It's Halloween theme.
Obviously, today's the 28th. We talked about this being just a recommended budget to be presented to the board. First slide, please. So I put a little twist on this year. I thought this would be interesting. First, as has been outlined, there is no request or recommendation for any millage adjustment increase, any sewer increase, which we've talked about these last couple of years. So the existing mills, as you will see, is 21.01, with 2021 being the same. Thought it would be interesting to just outline, based on a $400,000 house, how each of those, what those millages translate to on a fund by fund basis, where we actually have a millage assigned to it. We'll go through each of these funds. I think they speak for themselves. But there would be no millage adjustment being requested or recommended for this year. Can we go to the next slide, please? Since I think generally when we talk about the budget of the township, we often refer to the general fund as the basis for what the primary discussion is. So we'll get into each of those, but I want to start with the financials with the board and with the public. So what you'll see is, to start, is a robust 2021 starting fund balance of $4.1 million. That does factor into it the $3 million down payment on the sewer system to be paid on or by December 15th. Now, as I said at the time when that was contemplated, we can see why that ends up being significant for our finances for 2021. As I've talked about the last number of years, there is essentially a structural imbalance in the general fund with the amount of revenue that we bring in and what the operational cost would be. There are some additional transfers for this year that we'll talk about. But I'll still say, in the end, for those that would ask, if the sewers do not close, we will owe that $3 million back to Aqua. And I think the budget that you'll see from me is fairly, it's not substantial in terms of requests for lots of additional spending, with the understanding in the end that the goal is to have as much money available if the sewers do not close, to provide that money back without having to go to take drastic actions of emergency loans and what have you to repay that if that would become necessary. But as you can see, we're starting the year with $4.1 million, ending the year with $2.5 million. So absent the $3 million down payment, we would be looking at a negative balance on its face, and the need for somewhere between a 2 and a 3 mil tax increase to maintain about a 5% fund balance. Can we have the next slide, please? So just very quickly, without going into enormous detail, that the general fund budget is broken up into various categories that are in the budget, and that budget is available online for everyone to look at. We have the description in the budget of the central government, which includes staff for the township manager, executive assistant, and stenographer. It also includes all of our professional services, municipal engineer, stormwater, solicitor, outside legal counsel, auditor, all of those additional services. Next slide, please. The next line we have in here is general expenditures is the category. It's on page 6 of your budget. This includes more of the specific benefits that we account for: medical insurance, disability, our Social Security match, FICA payroll match, our property and liability, workers' compensation insurance, and obviously not funded to the level of health insurance, the various committees that we have, in the township, the volunteer committees. I did make a note here that our general fund budgeted healthcare is a 2.2% amount higher than in 2020. We do have healthcare expenditures in other parts of the budget where the increase was higher than that. But overall in the general fund, it was another very good year with year-over-year expenses in that regard. Next slide, please. This is a fairly straightforward item. Essentially is the finance department that covers 3 full-time and 1 part-time person listed on page 7 of your budget. There's a couple of other items in there just that are not of significant financial consequence for office products and, relative items just with running the office. Next item, please. Next slide. This is our tax collector's office. That is an elected position and not a staff person for the township. That pay is set via separate resolution by the board, with that pay currently listed at $31,500, which it's been for the last number of years. And that is listed on page 8 of your budget. Next slide, please. This is the IT budget listed on page 9 of your budget. I will note that both the year-end number for 2020 and the 2021 budgeted amount are significantly higher than they would have been. So, for example, in 2020, we budgeted $146,000 for this category. The driver of that is that we've gone to these remote meetings and we've incurred additional costs. And those remote meetings wouldn't just include the Board of Supervisors, but all the groups that are meeting. And as I pointed out at the last meeting, one of the benefits I think we've had with this is that we've had the committees, I believe, a lot more active in terms of meeting on a monthly basis, but it would include all the committees, the zoning hearing board, the planning commission, and everything that we do to function as a township. Next slide, please. So this will be listed on page 10 of your budget, obviously the largest department that we have. This includes 40 full-time officers and 4 full-time civilian employees. Listed and not in this department, just as a point of reference, we'll talk about it later, is for 2021, the police, Chief Coluzzi, have made a request to me for $158,000 in capital expenses, which is for 2 police cars, vehicle electronic reporting software, and modifications to the 2nd floor of our building. If anyone who's familiar with our building knows how tight the police department is, the intent of that would be to add some offices and some interview rooms when they're doing investigations. From my own perspective, again, the request is modest, understanding what we talked about as far as watching our money this year. 2 police cars is a modest request, and I think not ideally where I would want to make recommendations to the board on a year-over-year basis that we would want. Chief Coluzzi has done a remarkable job managing his overtime, managing his staff. This is barely, in terms of dollars year over year, not much more than 2% year over year. So that is the biggest line item in the budget. And if we could go to the next slide, please. This planning and zoning budget does cover all costs associated with the planning and zoning department. That includes the full-time positions listed. Again, for a town our size, we have in terms of staff, we have a full-time planning and zoning director, one code enforcement officer who's full-time, and 2 administrative assistants. That is extraordinarily lean in terms of the amount of calls, the amount of investigations, the amount of plans and reviews and everything that we're doing. But this also does include the costs associated with the building inspector, or what we call the building code official, and the related costs with the zoning hearing board and the planning commission. Can you have the next slide, please? This is our public works department, which starts on page 12 of your budget. As you can see, the full cost of the department is budgeted at $2,114,692. This includes public works director, administrative assistant, a full-time assistant, and 12 laborers in the department. Again, I'm going to make this point because I think it's important. We have a town of 130 miles or so and 12 full-time laborers to cover the town. And that by most measures is lean in terms of the coverage that we have. This also breaks out the cost that we have with building maintenance, the recycle yard, leaf collection, basin maintenance, highway maintenance, all of the related overtime with weather-related instances and snow and ice control. There are some capital requests that we'll go over, which is in the road machinery fund, but that's the Public Works Department. Next slide, please. As I did last year, I like to put these dates out to the board earlier than later. As you can see, so for 2019, we started with 4 Saturdays scheduled a year. This past year in 2020, we moved it to 5. I have 5 listed here as well. It should be noted, though, that in both of those years, we had storms that we ended up opening additional days. I think this past year we opened an additional weekday and additional weekend. In the budget document itself, we'll continue to track how many people, how many households are coming in. As you all are aware, when COVID hit, the first scheduled day that we had, we delayed, but then we opened back up under more rigorous controls to keep people coming in safe as well as the employees safe. Next slide, please. So this fire protection fund is 0.9 mils. And we also get funding in there from the Commonwealth, which is called relief. It's called fire relief money. So here's the outline of where we have budgeted those expenses to go. Some of that money, again, if you'll see Relief Association is a 1-for-1 swap with relief money that we receive. The only thing I would add in here that I am going to tweak a bit here is that Yardley Makefield Fire Company, I'm going to be asking and requesting that to go just up to $360,000. It has been $355,000 in the past. We are carrying about an $85,000 or $90,000 fund balance in that account. I had a meeting with representatives of the department today. They had asked, and there would not be any millage adjustment or anything required. We're just sitting there holding a fund balance. They had asked originally if they could have that for last year, and we weren't as certain of our fund balance we are this year. So I'd be asking for that when we go to preliminary budget, that would be increased to $360,000. Next line item, please. I'm sorry, next slide, please. Excuse me. A lot of times people ask me this, and it is, yes, we do have to pay for fire hydrants. We have to pay for the water to be pressurized. We have to pay for the water itself. And that amounts to about 900 hydrants in the township. It's 0.33 mils. And that covers those related costs for the year. Next slide, please. Our debt services fund. We do have debts in other parts of the budget, but for the general fund, it's 2.79 mils. Now, that includes our bond payments, but it also includes a radio payment that we make that the police department purchased a number of years ago that has a couple of years left. But this is where the auditors have recommended that it gets assigned. So we will transfer money from the general fund to the debt services fund to pay that expense. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is the ambulance fund, 0.38 mils. If you all will recall, in 2019, we tweaked this marginally. We were, I believe it was 0.33 mils, and we were then budgeting and allocating out of the general fund a separate dollar amount that was going over to the ambulance fund. So now this is all self-contained. This provides that assistance of about $200,000 and change to the Yardley Makefield Emergency Unit Ambulance Squad, and that's what that's targeted for. We have the next slide, please. This road machinery fund is where we buy our public works equipment, and as you all are aware, we have been using short-term financing to purchase equipment. As I have outlined here, in 2019 and 20, we currently have financed, we've purchased and currently have financed the 10-wheel dump truck and our new street sweeper that has been actively around town. This year, we've purchased a new 5,500 dump truck that's being financed over 3 years. So for 2021, we're actually requesting funding to finance a wheel loader and a backhoe, and to purchase outright a paving roller for when we do our in-house road repairs, and to pay for that outright for $45,000. And that would give our year-end fund balance of $113,000. That fund balance needs to be to that extent, because as these payments come due, several of them all at once, this will give us enough cushion that this 0.3 mils can sustain all of these payments as we stagger them to buy new pieces of equipment after old pieces of equipment, after the 3 to 5 year repayments, which are then coming at the end of their payment life, roll off those required payments. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is the liquid fuels budget that I know we've talked about quite a bit. This is the money that comes in from Pennsylvania through a formula that is based upon the miles of roads that we have in the township, that is based upon the fuel tax that's collected, and a variety of other things that I won't get too far in the weeds with. So our anticipated funding, we were notified by PennDOT, is going to be down about $100,000 this year. We also purchase rock salt out of this fund, and we pay for some of our public works labor when they do road work out of this fund. So the amount of fund balance that we had a year ago going into 2020 enabled us to have a larger paving budget than many previous years that we had had. So the budget, if you look at it, and for the board's sake, 1 second, that is listed on page. It's on page 55. But what I'd like to do is, as you all know, last year we established a 3-year paving plan. The great news is, with year 1 for 2020, we paved all of the roads on that plan. And we added, if you'll recall, we added Milton, which was listed on the 2021 paving plan. So I think you'll hear this later as well. Most of the schedules that we established this year for benchmarks for what we wanted to do, we met, which I think is a tribute to the board following through and staff managing the funding that we have. Could we go to the next slide, please? So if you look at 2021, the paving plan, if you looked at last year's budget, this is exactly what we had listed, minus Milton. So we have about $650,000 to pave. So the fact that Milton came off and we did it this year when we had a little bit extra money allows us to keep this intact the way that it was. We were back out, the engineer, the public works director were back out looking at the roads, making sure that they felt that this would still be in the first year. I do want to point out a couple of things that I think are relevant, are things that we discussed earlier in this year. And that is, moving forward, the goal is going to be to, as best we can, pave in areas where we're not restaging all over town. So as we do that, we'll be assessing roads in an area and their relative condition where it would not necessarily be every single worst road in the township, if they're all over, may not be paved in the same year. However, I think we would recognize, and the staff has recognized, and this came up in the discussions with the residents that were concerned about the paving of Silo Road, that we do have other roads in the township, and not just Silo Road, that fall into that category where we paved in a general area and there were these straggler roads left over, because at the time, I think the feeling was they did not rise to the level to need paved. So in 2022, that's coming, in 2023, we're going to make a concerted effort to pick off those roads, understanding the goal that I just described moving forward. Can you go to the next slide, please? So if you look at the 2022 year, this mirrors the previous plan, which would have been year 3, which is now year 2. Except one of the things that we had done is we added Silo Road into that plan. The other roads were all listed from last year. Can we go to the next slide then, please, as well? So for 2023, picking up on the point that I just made, if you looked at Hollow Branch, Greenview Road, and Overlook, which are in the Oxford Glen neighborhood, I think staff and the public works director would essentially describe those 3 roads as leftover from a previous paving period that we're going to pick off now. And actually, the roads underneath those are the roads adjacent to that neighborhood to pick off as well. So can we go to the next slide, please? So if we go back to 2021 and just to re-examine those roads, I asked staff to go out and the public works director specifically to take some pictures for the board regarding the relative condition of these roads. I understand you all typically are all over town and see these things, but I think at least for the public presentation and for you all, I just would like to go through these for you all to see. Can we go to the next slide, please? Next one, I'm sorry, keep it. So if we look here, we have Westover at Ellington Road. Next, please. Westover at Vernon Lane. Keep going because Westover is going to go on. Westover at Etten Road. Next one, please. This is right at 1902 Westover Road. We can see this. So, and again, can you go back, please? Thank you. So what we'll see, like in some of these, is going to be the point I think the engineer and the public works director had made is we get to a certain point where we've patched the road and the cracks of the holes move and it gets to the point where there's not much left you can do with it. Next slide, please. Here we have 1905 Westover, continues on. You can see the same, please go back, thank you. You can see the same pattern that we have as far as patching that road in the center, and the condition that it's in. Next slide, please. Effingham at Westover as well. Overall, not as bad as what we saw, but cracked and continuing on to pave that. Next, please. Shelley Lane at Westover, you can see the condition, especially around the inlets in the areas crossing the road. Next slide, please. Here's 3 Shelley Lane, which is picking up off the last slide as far as the cracking. Next, please. Shelley Lane at Yardley Morrisville Road. You can see the condition there. Continued on. Next slide, please. There's another one as well at Yardley Morrisville Road from the other side. Keep going, please. Next slide. Shelley Lane at Moon Drive. You can see the condition there as far as that goes. That was patched this year. You can see what happened is what I just described. Next slide, please. Here's 98 Tudor Lane, sort of in the shade, but I think you can see there on the right side and down the center, same sort of theme. Next slide, please. 101 Tudor Lane, where we've taken those pictures that you can see the condition of the road. Next slide, please. Here's Tudor Lane at 1700 Westover Road. We just took a shot all the way down from that point. Next slide, please. Okay, now we can look here at Ovington Road at 1802. If you look down the center there, you can see sort of it's been, you know, we've tinkered with it as much as we can, we believe. Next slide. 103 Vernon Lane. You can see the size of that drop off there, that crack and the deterioration that's taken place. Next slide, please. This is next slide. Vernon Lane at Yardley Morrisville Road. You can see where we've continued to patch that and it continues to move and get bigger. Next slide. We have 3 Radcliffe Lane. I think if you look close, you can see there's some shade that's coming down, but I think if you look in that area, you can see. Next slide, please. Black Rock Road at Chestnut. I think if you see there on the right side coming down that seam, the condition of the road there. Next slide, please. Black Rock Road at Kenmore. You can see, I think this angle gives you a clearer shot of the deterioration of what we're looking at. Next slide, please. We have Black Rock Road at Canal. See the same thing. The road is nearing the end of its life. Next slide. Friar Road at 341 Sherwood. You can see the condition of the road cracking at this angle. I think if we'll go farther down, you'll see more. Next slide, please. It's at 623 Friar at Trend Road. You can see the same, you know, a continuation more of what we're seeing at the intersection. Next slide. Friar Drive at Daleview Drive. Same sorts of conditions that we're seeing. Keep going, please. Next slide. Friar at, how do you say that, Chief? How do you say that road? Is that Teach Drive? But you can see down the center lane there the problems we're having, and then how that cracking and that spider web cracking is occurring. Next one is go ahead. Next slide is at 381. Sort of a longer view. We can see the condition. Next slide, please. Here's at Friar. I think Greg in this picture is trying to pick up close here, closer to you as far as the cracking. Next slide, please. 657 at Friar, just from a different angle. Next slide, please. 625 at Trend Road. I think you can see there the crack running across and down the center of the road. Some of these angles in the pictures pick up better than others. Next slide, please. This is Wynwood at Friar. The next one we can see the condition there that's been patched and patched and patched, and we're to the point now where I think it's getting down into the base and it's going to need a milling and more significant repair. Next slide, please. Here's Wynwood at 675 Friar. You can see, I think you can look down and see the condition as we continue to go down. Next slide, please. I think that's also, Greg, is that also at Wynwood? Are you on, Greg?
Yeah, that one's actually Vernon. It was the end slide.
Thank you. So those are the roads for this year. These were identified actually in our original 3-year plan from last year. And we're leaving those roads as is. As indicated, the adjustment that we had made was adding silo to year 2. And then again, this priority that we want to have with silo and the roads in 2023 to start to pick off those roads that we had that were left over from previous years as we move forward, trying to tackle this in a little bit different way. Can we go to the next slide, please? That's everything I have for roads. The next slide here in terms of the budget are pension payments for 2021. The township does receive state aid for pensions in the amount of 500. And actually, that is a typo. That will be $520,000 and not 29. I'll make sure that we update that, but the budget is reflective of $520,000. And this does, and as we've talked about pensions this year for the police defined benefit plan, the non-uniform, so non-police defined benefit plan, and then everyone hired after January 1st, 2012 is in the defined contribution plan. We do have pension expenses distributed throughout the budget in the departments, but for the amount in the general fund, this is the amount that we would be paying. The net payment then from the township, if you factor that aid in, is a little over $850,000, which is similar to the payment last year. There was not a significant spike in that payment. Next slide, please. The park and recreation budget is 2.43 mils. The budget itself covers the cost of 2 full-time administrative employees, a portion of the salaries of 2 other employees that we split between Park and Rec and the pool, 4 full-time laborers and 1 part-time seasonal employee. Last year's budget did recommend the adding 1 additional labor that we held off on with the uncertainty of where our finances would be. It is being recommended again for this year to hire that full-time labor beginning on May 1st. The budget also covers costs associated with all of our parks listed there. The township is responsible for 550 acres of parkland, bike path, and the pool. The group of employees also oversees community events, recreation classes, summer camp, and pavilion rentals. As I said, we are contemplating the hiring of 1 additional labor, new commercial doors on the community center. If that sounds familiar, that was an item in the 2020 budget that we held off on for the same reason that we held off on the labor that we're putting back in there for consideration for this year. Repairing the tennis courts at Community Park. And Monica can speak about this if you want her to when we're done here, or even at the preliminary budget, completing a needs assessment and strategic plan for the department. Can you go to the next slide, please? So if I look at these costs, and in the budget, we can talk about where this stuff is located. I've priced this out. The one thing I did not mention that we have in the budget is the Woodside Road bike path. Just so everyone understands where we currently stand, we do have about $172,500 essentially already in hand, meaning we already have a match that we put aside. We have a grant that we have successfully obtained from the Greenway Trails and Recreation Fund, and we have a large request in for a multimodal grant for over $430,000 that we should hear about early in the year. So at least under our current funding structure, pursuing this project in 2021 would require a positive response to that grant request. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the community park tennis court, which is the one item we have on here that I just mentioned, I asked the park and rec director to take a couple of pictures so you could just see what we're talking about. Again, we're talking about essentially a patch to that would be about $30,000. That would obviously have to be bid out, or if that's on if that'd be something that would be on one of our consortium lists that we could co-stars or what have you. But next slide, please. And you can see, as much as I suppose it's a skill that you learn how to play, instead of playing the baseline that you play the crack when you're playing tennis that you could win. It's probably it's best to get that repaired. It was Monica has strongly pushed that this is something she wants to get repaired. We're asking for consideration. Can we go to the next slide, please? One of the other items that we have in here is the Memorial Park Playground. We have this tear that you can see on the material it's larger than it looks in that picture. The company that originally installed this is out of business. So, we're going to have, Monica's going to have a challenge matching that fabric up exactly, but we're asking for that to be repaired. That's obviously heavily utilized. It's a new playground to begin with, and we have that in there for consideration. Next slide, please. So, consistent with our road paving plan, our 2020 trail plan, we repaired all the trails that we had in that plan, which I'm excited about. So 2021 and 2022 is consistent with the 3-year plan that you saw last year. 2023 is what we've added this year, which you can see is Edgewood Road from Longacre to Candace, estimated currently at about $23,000. So I think the goal that we said last year was to start to establish this, that we start picking these areas off. We talk a lot about trails and adding trails, having a focus on repairing and maintaining the ones that we have is smart. And I think if we do it in this manner, we don't have to spend a great deal of money, but doing pieces of this year over year, I think will make a dramatic impact. Next slide, please. So I just want you all to have this. And again, when we get into the preliminary budget, we can talk about this. So the only fee adjustments that the Park and Rec Director is suggesting is before you, as you see. So the field rental addition and the picnic pavilion would be new fees. There's a picnic pavilion hourly rental that there's a marginal increase being requested. So Monica can talk about that when we get more into the bones of the Park and Rec Department. I just wanted you all to be aware of that. Next slide, please. So the pool, which I know I've gotten a lot of inquiry about, we have budgeted to open the pool. We are currently estimating, and I can't say that there's been a lot of science behind this, quite honestly, 80% membership collection in terms of family memberships is the biggest one across the board. We're assuming that will be 80% for 2021. The general fund, so that provides a shortfall in the year of about $180,000. In the past, and this year as an example, we have relied, and I have said that the backstop for the pool would be the Park and Rec Fund. The Park and Rec Fund used considerable resources this year to balance out the pool. Because even though the pool was closed, we have certain fixed expenses and staff expenses assigned to the pool. So even though those individuals were repurposed, as an example, 2 of the pool employees, for example, coordinated with the police department and our seniors program to call every household every day throughout this pandemic. But those costs still are assigned to the pool. So understanding that Park and Rec really utilized a lot of its available resources to offset those costs. I have the general fund and the Park and Rec budget has $60,000 or $70,000 of projected fund balance at the end of next year. That for this year it would require reliance on the general fund. Now, if we get to 100% membership collection, that number is obviously less. If we're at 50% membership collection, it would have the opposite effect. So I think we're not here tonight to talk about what's going to be the plan to reopen the pool. That warrants its own discussion. regarding how that will work. I think, though, for the public to know is that the plan is to open it. We are budgeting that it will need assistance to be able to open, which we're prepared to recommend that we can accommodate. I think that's very positive. We will start those discussions very early in the year, how that will work. I like to put this in here because I think it's important. There's been a lot of people who've called, who've questioned whether or not whether there's the desire to reopen the pool. And I just want to remind the public that it was in 2019 that we spent about $500,000 to fix the gutter system in the pool, to fix the slides in the pool, which resulted in the savings of about 2.5 million gallons of water a year. So that sizable expense, I'm excited to have the benefits of that by lower water bills and a better pool. So it is recommended in 2021 for an estimated cost of $19,000 that 4 of the panels on the slide need to be replaced. We would move to do that early in the year, understanding that we intend to work to open the pool. The next slide, please. I just have this one slide here now regarding golf. And that is that the general fund is assumed to assist the golf course from the budget perspective or in the budget document for $289,000 in 2020. As I had previously presented in my manager's report, that assistance to the golf course this year was significantly higher. It was about $670,000. Total debt payments, as we talk about a lot for the golf course, is similar to last year's number at $1,039,000 and change. We go to the next slide, please. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, there's not a sewer rate increase being requested. And I get this question, I'm sure this is going to be a question you're all going to get that I will answer. It would be the intention of staff to present to the board early on that we will pursue the maintenance plan, that meaning it being the I&I projects to line the pipes. We have a pump station in there to ask Ebert Engineering to start preparing those specs at the beginning of the year. Because regardless of the sale happening, these improvements need to be made to the system. And it's my opinion that if we own the system, and as long as we own the system, we work to get as many of those things done in the meantime. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is consistent with the plan that you saw last year regarding the capital and maintenance plan and the budgeted expenses that we would anticipate. If you look in the budget, that is online, the board has before you, understand that we have not closed yet on the system. This is a 7-year sewer capital plan that we will maintain. We did add the 7th year in there that I'm not going to go through all of those at this point, but that 7th year has been added for your review. Next slide, please. So, we're getting near the end of this, so I want to summarize things quickly, and then I'm going to have one new item that is in my manager's report that I want to make sure that we talk about publicly. So, as you know, we have several funds, and I've talked about this in different ways here. So, in our capital reserve fund, you can see we have essentially 3 requests that I've already talked about when we discussed with the police department, which is $158,000. Under the Recreation Capital Reserve Fund, as I've outlined here, $625,000 estimated cost. We currently have $178,000 in hand. We're waiting on this grant request. Special projects for 2020. These all look familiar because these are all the projects that we've carried over from last year. I've made some adjustments because we've spent some of the professional services costs, so it'll be slightly lowered. This includes the Sandy Run Roundabout. And I do want to say this. So I know how important this project is. We have estimated that project would cost $500,000. Construction, there'll be some inspections fees. Do I necessarily think it's going to be $735,000? I don't have any reason to think that. But I've grossed that number up for the sake that in the end, from a budget perspective, and this is not direct tax money. This is from bond proceeds from the bond that was previously issued. So there is money in that account sitting there for us to have flexibility if for some reason the project cost comes in more than the $500,000 or so that we had been anticipating. This also includes the signalization and intersection projects at Big Oak and 332 in Mirror Lake. As I said recently, I would anticipate, first off, I anticipate, that Sandy Run that we're going to be making a presentation to the board on the design in November, probably at the November 18th meeting, with the goal that that will be bid out in December and would be an early 2021 project. Big Oak Road and Route 332, our traffic engineer, Safe Engineering, is putting those specs together, and I would expect that that'll be in November and that those will be bid out probably in December as well, maybe early January. The community trail project that you're all very familiar with, that's gone through several committees recently, that's come back before the board, that's going to be bid out by PennDOT, and we are about done with that in terms of the PennDOT approvals and requirements that we would need. I would anticipate that PennDOT will have that out to bid by the end of the year or early next year. I have one final item. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, as the board is aware, and I think I have in the report, if anybody read that out in public, and this is new, and if not, this will be very new. It was about a year ago that the Federal Railroad Administration inspector from out of town was quietly, urgently trying to sit with me. And I know there's a lot of people involved in the quiet zone. So I'll try to break this down and I'll let the board discuss this as they will. When the plan was sent to and approved by the Federal Railroad Administration, the median on the southern entrance was 100 feet long. For some reason, at the time that was bid out, that at the last minute appears that it changed to 60 feet. Instead of 100. Now, without getting too far in the weeds, I want to share what I know. I know that there was a property owner over there who was expressing concerns that PennDOT shared that the 100-foot length median would prohibit them from making a left-hand turn out of their property, and was either unwilling or reluctant to issue the necessary permits, the highway occupancy permit that we would need if it was built at 100 feet. However, the plan that was submitted and approved by the Federal Railroad Administration still listed the project at 100 feet. It got built at 60 feet. So we were about a year ago provided an initial inspection report that it failed. This was reported to the board at the time. However, we were instructed by the inspector to wait for the FRA's final report and analysis before we do anything. This was part of the Quiet Zone project that had 3 areas, and we also got some federal funding for it. At the time, as I said to the board, I conveyed to the inspector that we would want to bring this in compliance. We were not going to question it. I cannot speak to what happened. It was before my time, before our current engineer's time, before our current planning and zoning director's time. And in those discussions, he laid out a couple of scenarios. So the median itself could be built at 60 feet as it currently is constructed. However, it would require a 4-quadrant gate system, which is more expensive that would beef up that crossing as a means of protection to the public. Now, if the township was unwilling to make the improvement necessary for this to pass a final inspection, we would be risking all of the quiet zones being deemed not in compliance and probably mandated to rip them all out. So he had indicated that he understood the severity of it. He also appreciated the cooperation of the Board of Supervisors and staff and willing to sit and pull the string on making this right, but we needed to wait for the report. Well, here we are about a year later, waiting for the report. I imagine this got held up in part because of the pandemic. I spoke to that inspector over the last few weeks, who's still with the FRA and has reached out to whoever the higher up that would issue this letter, asking for that to come out because he understood, and the board had strongly suggested that we need to move on this. We have been advised that this is not in compliance and we intend to fix it. So in the budget, you have a $500,000 line item listed under special projects that would come from bond proceeds that fortunately, because the board has been aggressive in understanding what we have and not spending what we have, and this would be eligible, that the money is there to fix this project. I am anticipating hearing from the inspector again in the coming weeks, as he assured me he would. He has resubmitted his report with asking for this to be moved along quickly so we can remedy it. And this is the first time we're presenting this. The intent all along was to have this discussion, but as you all know, and as our solicitor knows, it was being strongly suggested by the FRA, their preference to not have us move on this until that report was issued. I think we made the decision here that we are aware that we're not in compliance. We're aware that they have said that this is a safety issue. And frankly, I think we need to get this budgeted and ready from our end. So when that report comes, we can move quickly to resolve this. That is all I have in terms of my presentation. I'm happy I have staff members here. I don't know whether there's questions or not. Again, we can have questions on the 14th, but I think we're all here to address any questions you have.
Thank you, Kurt. I'll open it.
We can pull those slides down now, please.
So at this time, we'll open it up to the board for any questions or comments, input, insights. You
So I don't know how the board feels about it before we go much further, Fred, and your input on this. If you believe, I think since we're here and people might be listening, about the time frame that I had set using existing meetings, if you would want to essentially have a preliminary budget vote on the 14th, on the 18th. That doesn't stop you all from discussing anything you want about the budget, follow-up questions, details on the 4th. Probably not a bad idea. And again, it allows you to do things unrestricted because you don't have a preliminary budget passed yet. So, but again, my thought would be the 18th to have a preliminary budget, the 16th of December to consider a final budget.
It sounds fine. We can put an agenda item on discussion items, a budget update, or budget discussion and discussion items for the first event on the 4th.
I don't have anything else to report.
At this time, since there's no board member comments or questions, we'll open up to the public. Monica, is there any public comment?
I'll make one. Sorry about that, Fred.
Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I'm Kurt. Just help me understand that. Like, is this the place for the level of feedback? Like, I appreciate that Monica was looking to hire a new laborer that was, planned for this year and delayed. Do we do I make my subtle pitch that that person be, really focused as an arborist or have the ability to deal with, spotted lanternflies and things like that? Or do I just leave that kind of micromanagement alone for now? Like, it's inappropriate at this type of conversation.
You can have that discussion whenever you like. I just will remind you all that, remember, this is a union position with certain parameters around those jobs. So bear with me. I want to, one of the things that we have is, and not to the level you're talking about, we do have training for the Park and Rec Department now to recognize trees, to not to the level of an arborist. But I mean, if there's a directive or an interest in the board, and having that skill set be more available, we can start even talking as, I don't want to say substitute, but, we do have tree companies and arborists that work with us in identifying problems if that need to become more active or focused in some different way than is currently happening. Most of the arborists we use now have been focused on the condition of trees. Do they need to come down? Are they healthy enough to stay up, and not necessarily into, whether it's at the ash tree problem and stuff. They look when there's a problem, but not necessarily a community-wide assessment, as an example. So you can discuss, that's my 2 cents worth, but you can discuss that in any way or in any time you want that you're a supervisor.
I guess I was hoping that maybe there would be a way that we could focus more on earlier prevention so that we don't have to wait to call in, the true professionals, because the tree's probably lost. And equally, I applaud you and our staff and our other supervisors for the work that we've been doing. But I wanted to talk about, I do appreciate that we are a lean township, and we need to be that lean township because of, where we are from a fiscal standpoint. But I would wonder if there is, when you talk about how lean as an example, planning and zoning is, it strikes me that maybe we could find a way to augment, supplement, increase that staff. Because we know that the township has grown. We know that our staff hasn't. And maybe there is some way to find some money to support a position there or some kind of assistance there.
Well, noted. I mean, and again, the thing about it is I hear your example about planning and zoning, and there are many. There are many. Essentially our IT person who does the troubleshooting around the township with people's computers is the captain of the police department. That's our IT person. We have Greg Hucklebridge, who's the public works director. In most towns, there is an assistant public works director who can be out with the crews managing projects and doing things. We don't have that. We have a planning department that's essentially 2 in one of the busiest planning departments in Bucks County. I mean, with permits, with everything that's going on. So we're lean around the board. I hear you about zoning. Quite honestly, I think the discussion is going to be not just a staff person in zoning, but software upgrades, that how we track permits and how we're alerted about permits that are coming up on due dates and legally required due dates that currently is a bit antiquated, and not as a bit, is antiquated. That requires a lot more work than probably is necessary to track. So, I hear you on planning and zoning. On a staff member, there are several others. And again, I just will say that the budget that you all saw was recognizing in the end that if we had to pay $3 million back, that we were in a position to be hovering right around the edges to being able to do that. So a staff member, like an assistant planning and zoning director, that would take over a portion of the operation and would serve, in my mind, as someone who wouldn't just assist the director, but could be sort of an operations officer that would get into the nitty gritty of the permits and when they're due and overseeing the building inspections company, handling complaints. And the planning and zoning director, is typical, would sort of have more of a macro view, coordinating with the planning commission, the zoning hearing board, processing things. Two sets of eyes on projects and violations is smart. And, so I don't have an answer for you, but that's a discussion the board can have.
Okay.
You're muted, Fred.
Monica, is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Oh, that was easy. So we will, I'm sure we'll have some more conversation about the budget on the 4th. Is there any other business? Hearing none, we'll adjourn this special meeting. See everybody next week at 7:30. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.